Take it back to an even worse one. That killed my family and left me dead. Player 1 wins. Step 2, stronger. A lot stronger. And step 3, join a team.
To the resistance.
Yeah, the mission is simple. Make the Vanderkoys pay.
Boy Kills World, 2024, presents a comprehensive analysis and explanation of its chaotic narrative, delving into the intricate layers of its dystopian revenge story. The film immediately establishes a world saturated in televised propaganda, where the totalitarian Van der Kooi family rules through fear and spectacle. This opening analysis explores how director Moritz Moore uses the annual culling broadcast not merely as a plot point, but as a foundational critique of state-sanctioned violence repackaged as entertainment for a desensitized populace. The film explores the blurred lines between reality and hallucination, primarily through the ghostly apparition of Boy's dead sister, Mina. This spectral figure serves as a visual representation of guilt and a fractured conscience. The explanation posits that Mina is not a mere ghost. She is a psychological projection of the childhood innocence and familial love that the shaman's brutal training regimen attempted to surgically remove from Boy's psyche. A thorough analysis of the Van der Kooi family reveals them as satirical archetypes of corrupt power rather than deeply fleshed-out villains. Hilda van der Kooi, the matriarch, manipulates with corporate slogans and a maternal facade, while her brother Gideon uses media propaganda. The film explains that their totalitarian regime is sustained by a fragile, squabbling family dynamic, showing that the end of the world is less a military coup and more a dysfunctional corporate board meeting with executions. The film's world-building is intentionally disorienting, plunging the audience into a dystopia with minimal exposition. An analysis of this in media res approach explains that the lack of context about the wider world is a deliberate choice. The narrative confines itself to the city and the Van der Kooi compound, mirroring Boy's own sheltered and brainwashed perspective, where the only reality that matters is the immediate objective of vengeance. A subtextual analysis reveals a dark satire of corporate sponsorship and state violence, epitomized by the frosty puffs, serial branding on executioner uniforms. This grotesque detail is not just background humor. It explains the film's cynical view of late-stage capitalism merging with fascism. The state literally sells the spectacle of death, packaging genocide as family-friendly entertainment, which desensitizes the citizens into complicit consumers. The choreography and action sequences demand a technical analysis, as they are a chaotic blend of video game logic and graphic novel hyperviolence. Fight scenes often involve inventive, improvised weapons, such as a cheese grater, which serves as a brutal and darkly humorous set piece. The explanation for this style is that the violence isn't meant to be realistic. It is a direct externalization of Boy's gamified inner world, where every enemy is just another NPC to be dispatched. An explanation of the film's polarizing directorial style by Moritz Moore points to its heavy borrowing from anime, martial arts films, and John Wick-esque gunfu. The camera work is kinetic and often jarring, employing rapid zooms and erratic movements to place the viewer inside Boy's disoriented headspace. While this creates a unique, energetic aesthetic, an analysis suggests it sometimes sacrifices spatial clarity, turning meticulously choreographed fights into a messy, albeit visceral, collage of limbs and blood. The relationship between Boy and the mysterious shaman forms the psychological core that the entire plot hinges upon. The film initially presents the shaman as a savior figure who rescues and trains Boy, yet there is an immediate undercurrent of cruelty in his methods. This analysis explains that the mentor-student dynamic is a textbook example of the cycle of abuse, where Boy's thirst for revenge is manufactured and exploited to serve the shaman's own political vendetta against the Van der Koys. A pivotal analysis focuses on the screenplay's twist, where Hilda van der Koy reveals herself to be Boy's true mother. This revelation completely upends the narrative's moral calculus. The explanation is a profound commentary on manufactured memory, where Boy's entire motivational framework, his love for his mother and sister, was a fiction crafted by the shaman using LSD and psychological torture to create the perfect assassin. The character of June 27th, the silent, motorcycle-helmeted enforcer for the Van der Koys, receives a significant analytical unpacking. The film reveals she is Mina, Boy's actual sister, who survived and was groomed as a loyalist. The helmet, initially a dehumanizing gimmick mistaken for a personality, becomes a tragic symbol of her own erased identity, making the siblings' final reunion a silent, devastating acknowledgement of their shared manipulation. The film's sound design and mixing become crucial elements for analysis, given the protagonist's deafness. The audio perspective frequently shifts, dropping diegetic sound to mimic Boy's experience, then filling the void with Benjamin's inner voice and a pounding musical score. This technique is an explanation of how the film translates a non-hearing person's world into a cinematic experience, making the audience feel the muffled isolation and the internal cacophony of visual stimuli. A structural analysis of the narrative reveals it follows a video game-level progression. Boy must fight his way through various mini-bosses within the Van der Koy Empire before reaching the final boss. Each fight introduces a new, quirky assassin or family member, which serves to pace the film episodically. This game-like structure explains the narrative's simplicity, prioritizing progression and skill demonstration over complex plot development in each encounter. The casting of Yayan Ruhian as the shaman is a profound intertextual nod to the Indonesian martial arts film The Raid, where he played the iconic Mad Dog. This analysis explains that his presence instantly conveys a silent promise of brutal, efficient violence. The film leverages the audience's genre memory, making the shaman's physical threat credible without extensive backstory, and his inevitable final showdown with Boy a climactic battle of dueling styles. The film examines the concept of the culling, not just as a political event, but as a ritualistic performance of power. The analysis of the game show style set design and the cheering audience explains how the regime manufactures consent. By turning murder into a lottery and a televised spectacle, the Van der Koys transform the populace from potential rebels into hopeful participants and entertained spectators, a chilling reflection of reality TV's voyeuristic cruelty. An explanation of the film's color palette and production design highlights a world of brutalist architecture juxtaposed with neon-soaked 1980s arcade aesthetics. The Van der Koys compound is sterile and corporate, while Boy's flashbacks to childhood have a warm, saturated glow. This visual dichotomy in the analysis represents the tension between the cold, totalitarian present and a nostalgic, perhaps entirely fabricated, memory of a happier past. The film's dark humor is a primary tool for tonal balance, acting as a pressure valve for the excessive gore. The analysis of jokes, like Boy accidentally finding a weapon because someone is inexplicably torturing a carrot, explains the film's comedic philosophy. The absurdity of the world is met with Boy's deadpan, internalized reactions, creating a dissonance that defines the movie's attempt to be simultaneously a brutal actioner and a goofy comedy. Jessica Roth's performance as June 27th, though physically expressive behind a mask, is an analysis of an actor constrained by a conceptual choice. Her eventual unmasking carries the film's emotional climax, yet the narrative keeps her voiceless for most of the runtime. This explanation suggests the film trades emotional connection for mystery, underutilizing her potential until the final act, when her silent reunion with Boy must convey a lifetime of lost love in seconds. The film's geopolitical commentary, while never explicit, operates through the totalitarian aesthetics. The van der Koi's culling can be analyzed as a metaphor for state-mandated population control and the spectacle of public executions in dystopian fiction, from Shirley Jackson's The Lottery to The Hunger Games. This analysis posits that the film updates this trope for a generation whose primary relationship with mass death is mediated through video games and viral videos. An analysis of the Super Dragon Punch Force 3 game within the film reveals it as the foundational myth of Boy's consciousness. The character he plays in his head, his entire understanding of heroism and conflict resolution, comes from this 2D fighter. The explanation here is that his reality is indistinguishable from a playthrough. He anticipates enemy patterns, uses special moves, and frames his entire quest for revenge as the ultimate high-score run. The film's failure at the box office is an interesting counterpoint to its critical analysis. The explanation for the commercial disconnect may lie in its audience targeting. The film is too graphically violent and weird for a mainstream action comedy audience, yet its narrative may seem too derivative of tropes from The Hunger Games and Deadpool for the hardcore cinephile crowd, leaving it in a no-man's land of niche appeal despite its cult ambitions. The supporting character duo of Benny and Basho, members of the Internal Resistance, function as the audience's initial interpreters of Boy. The analysis of their dynamic explains that they provide necessary exposition and moments of levity, serving as normal-minded foils to Boy's silent, single-minded absurdity. Their presence grounds the second act, offering a brief respite where dialogue and human connection attempt to pierce Boy's video game reality. The screenplay's treatment of masculinity is subject to analysis through Boy's physical and emotional conditioning. The shaman's training seeks to strip Boy of all emotion, turning him into a weapon, which is a hypermasculine ideal of stoicism. Yet the film constantly undercuts this with Boy's inner voice, a bumbling, sarcastic commentator who reveals the terrified, confused child beneath the ripped muscle, deconstructing the archetype of the silent, invincible action hero. The climactic battle between Boy, Mina, and the shaman is an intricate ballet of blood that serves as the final thematic argument. The analysis of the choreography here is that it shifts from gunplay and weapons to raw, visceral hand-to-hand combat, reflecting a stripping away of external gimmicks. This is not just a fight for survival. It is a violent reclamation of their stolen autonomy, a brother and sister literally beating the trauma out of each other's past. The film's final moments, with Boy and Mina escaping the bunker into an uncertain world, offer an ending that resists catharsis. An analysis of this conclusion explains that they are not triumphant heroes, but deeply traumatized survivors with no memories they can truly trust. The world outside is unknown, and their shared identity is a shattered mirror they must piece back together, leaving the audience with a haunting sense of a beginning rather than an end. A significant analytical thread is the way the film visualizes Boy's fight sequences as a dance of death, with each move influenced by his gaming persona. When Boy uses a cheese grater as a weapon, the analysis explains this as a perfect melding of the domestic and the horrific, a found weapon mechanic straight out of a survival game. This blend of the mundane and the monstrous is the film's signature for creating memorable, cringeworthy action beats. The shaman's use of LSD as a brainwashing tool warrants a specific psychological analysis. It's not a magical potion, but a crude, chemical method for breaking down a child's psyche to overwrite it. The explanation for this choice is that it grounds the film's most fantastic element, complete memory replacement, in a gritty, horrifyingly plausible form of abuse, making the shaman's evil tangible and scientifically conceivable rather than supernatural. The wardrobe and character design are essential to the film's graphic novel aesthetic. Hilda van der Koi's severe, high-collared outfits and corporate chic style mark her as a CEO of fascism, while the colorful, anarchic looks of the resistance fighters represent their chaotic freedom. An analysis of costuming explains how the film uses clothing as immediate visual shorthand for a character's alignment in the conflict without needing dialogue. The narrative device of the inner voice is analyzed as a potential crutch that occasionally undermines Bill Skarsgård's physical performance. While Skarsgård communicates profound confusion and pain through his eyes and body language, Benjamin's voiceover often explains exactly what he is thinking. This explanation highlights a central tension. The film trusts its visual storytelling enough to have a mute protagonist, but not enough to let his silence speak entirely for itself. The film's entire premise can be analyzed through the lens of Platonic allegory, specifically the cave. Boy is raised in a cave-like bunker by the shaman, who projects reality, the truth of his family's murder, onto the wall. The escape from the bunker and the discovery of the Van der Kooi family's truth represent the painful ascent from the cave, where the sunlight of truth is initially blinding and disorienting, causing him to violently reject his own manufactured shadow reality. The music supervision and score are critical components worthy of analysis, as they blend a retro synthwave sound with the pounding drums of a tribal war chant. This oral landscape mirrors the protagonist's bifurcated mind. The nostalgic, synthetic beats of a lost 80s-90s childhood arcade, clashing against the primal, organic reality of physical combat. The explanation is that the soundtrack is the sound of Boy's inner conflict between programmed fantasy and bloody reality. An analysis of the film's editing rhythm finds it deliberately manic, cutting between slow-motion shots of graphic impact and sped-up sequences of tactical reloading and movement. This creates a visual tempo that mimics the stop-start pacing of a fighting game, where moments of intense action are punctuated by brief, tense periods of repositioning. The editing suite becomes a joystick, controlling the viewer's adrenaline in a manner entirely sympathetic to the gamer brain. The thematic exploration of freedom fighters versus terrorists is handled with intentional moral ambiguity. The resistance that Benny and Basho belong to is fighting the totalitarian regime, but the film doesn't delve into their political ideology beyond survival. This analysis suggests that the film is less interested in the politics of liberation and more in the personal vendetta, making a subtle point that in a world this broken, all violence becomes a matter of personal trauma rather than ideological purity. The character of Gideon Van der Kooi, played by Brett Gelman, is a satirical stand-in for the screenwriter and propagandist. His bone-dry delivery and meta-commentary on the state's messaging make him a distinct kind of evil, the intellectual architect of misery. The analysis of Gideon explains that he represents the power of narrative itself, the man who writes the script that the family and the populace follow, making him more dangerous than the soldiers. The film's depiction of Sister Mina, as both a haunting vision and a brainwashed soldier, is a deep psychological study in fragmentation. Boy's hallucinatory Mina is sweet and childlike, a manifestation of his guilt. The real Mina, June 27th, is a stoic killer. The analysis of this split explains how trauma can freeze a loved one in time, making the reality of their survival and change a shocking, world-altering collision that Boy's psyche can barely process. The environmental storytelling in the Van der Kooi compound is rich with detail. The juxtaposition of opulent, futuristic living quarters with the grim, industrial killing floors below deck explains the regime's structure. The analysis finds a vertical hierarchy of hypocrisy. The family dines in luxury while the machinery of death churns directly beneath their feet, a spatial metaphor for the willful ignorance that sustains their rule. A focused analysis on the single-take fight sequences, or the failed one-shots, as some critics called them, reveals a bold ambition. More attempts to string long takes together with hidden digital stitches, but the effect can sometimes disorient rather than immerse. This explanation is that the technical execution fails to match the ambition, creating a visual confusion that mirrors Boy's mind but harms the clarity of the spectacular stunt work being performed. The film's narrative twist reframes the shaman's brutal training not as forging a weapon for justice, but as poetic punishment for Boy's childhood insubordination. The analysis reveals a bitter irony. Boy was kidnapped and tortured because he refused to kill the shaman's family. His punishment was to be forced into the role of a killer, brainwashed to believe he was avenging a family that was never his, making his story a tragic cycle of forced violence. The movie serves as a showcase for Bill Skarsgård's physical acting prowess, demanding an analysis of his silent performance. Stripped of his iconic Pennywise voice, Skarsgård uses micro-expressions to convey a childlike confusion that no amount of muscle can hide. The explanation is that his performance is a constant tug-of-war between the lethal instrument his body has become and the scared boy his eyes reveal him to be, grounding the cartoonish violence in genuine pathos. The rapid-fire flashbacks that pepper the fight scenes are not just stylistic flourishes, but fragmented memory data. An analysis of these jittery, subliminal images explains them as a neurological glitch. As Boy's body operates on killer instinct, his brain flashes with corrupted .jpeg files of his past, a visual representation of the shaman's faulty programming fighting against his true, buried memories trying to surface. The world's absurdity is further deepened by its background details, like the Frosty Puffs cereal branding. The analysis of this specific prop explains how it satirizes the banality of evil. Genocide is sponsored by a sugary breakfast cereal, making the murderers look like NASCAR drivers or influencers hawking products. A damning commentary on how commercialism robs even the most horrific acts of their dignity and moral weight. The comic relief provided by Boy's inner voice often clashes violently with the on-screen gore, creating a profound tonal whiplash that is the film's most defining feature. The analysis of this clash explains that it is entirely intentional, meant to replicate the internet-age experience of scrolling from a meme to a real-life atrocity in seconds. The film's own soul is a chaotic browser tab, unable to settle on a single emotional register. The relationship between Boy and his hallucinated sister is the film's true love story, far more central than any romantic subplot. His drive is fueled by a spectral, imagined version of Mina, a perfect memory of childhood loyalty. The analysis of their one-sided conversations explains that he is fighting to avenge a ghost, making the real Mina's appearance a complicated anticlimax to the idealized fantasy that has been his sole companion for years. The film's final battle offers a detailed analysis of catharsis through brutality. As Boy and Mina finally take on the shaman, the fight is a messy, desperate scramble. There is no graceful martial arts victory, only a survivalist's ugly brawl. This explanation suggests that the film intentionally denies the audience a clean, satisfying revenge kill, replacing it with an exhausting, traumatic struggle that reflects the true cost of their artificially built lives. The epilogue's ambiguous tone provides a final analytical point. The siblings escape the physical bunker, but the psychological bunker of their conditioning remains. The analysis concludes that the film ends on a note of profound existential uncertainty. They are free, but their entire lives have been a constructed narrative. Their names, their memories, their purpose were given to them. The real world is a blank, terrifying screen they must now write on themselves. The dialectical tension between the film's comic book panel framing and its fluid, kinetic violence creates a unique visual language that demands careful scrutiny. Specific shots freeze into tableau-like compositions reminiscent of graphic novel splash pages, with bodies suspended midair and blood arcing in perfect parabolic curves. These frozen moments punctuate the chaos, allowing the eye to register the intricate geography of carnage before the motion resumes. The analysis reveals that this technique serves a dual purpose, both celebrating the aesthetic beauty of choreographed ultraviolence and providing the audience with brief cognitive rest stops amid relentless sensory assault. The shaman's compound, hidden deep within a forested wilderness, functions as a geographical and psychological counterpoint to the Van der Koi's sterile urban fascism. Where the city operates through technological surveillance and media saturation, the shaman's world is primal, governed by physical pain and natural poisons like LSD derived from organic compounds. The environmental analysis contrasts these two poles of control, explaining that Boy's journey is not just a revenge quest, but a pilgrimage from one totalitarian regime to another, dressed in different ideological clothing, but equally committed to erasing individual will. The film's treatment of food and consumption emerges as a surprisingly coherent thematic thread upon closer examination. The Van der Kooi family is consistently shown enjoying lavish banquets and branded cereals while their subjects starve, a literal representation of their parasitic relationship with society. The shaman's training, meanwhile, involves deprivation and near starvation, weaponizing hunger itself. This analysis of alimentary imagery explains how consumption becomes a moral barometer, where to eat is to be complicit and Boy's ascetic, food-ignoring existence throughout the film marks him as a being existing entirely outside normal human economies of pleasure and sustenance. Bill Skarsgård's physical transformation for the role goes beyond mere muscular hypertrophy, incorporating a specific quality of movement that suggests a body never taught to inhabit space naturally. His gait alternates between predatory stillness and explosive, almost ungainly lunges, as if his limbs are weapons that happen to be attached to a person rather than integrated components of a human being. The performance analysis explains that Skarsgård moves like a fighting game character brought to life, his transitions between idle animation and attack combos lacking the fluid intermediate states that characterize natural human locomotion. The retrofuturistic technology scattered throughout the film's world design deserves analytical attention for its deliberate anachronism. Arcade cabinets exist alongside advanced holographic surveillance systems, and muscle cars share streets with futuristic military transports. This temporal incoherence is not lazy production design, but a calculated effort to create a world frozen in cultural stasis, where the regime has monopolized technological progress for control while keeping the populace entertained with deliberately obsolete diversions that pose no intellectual threat to the status quo. The concept of the unreliable narrator is pushed to its extreme limits through the film's twist, retroactively transforming the entire preceding narrative into a kind of tragic dramatic irony. Every moment of Boy's righteous fury, every hallucinated conversation with his dead sister, every training montage framed as heroic preparation, becomes retrospectively tainted with the knowledge that it was all built on chemically induced falsehoods. This narrative analysis reveals that the film punishes the audience's own bloodlust, making viewers complicit in cheering for violence that was engineered from the start as a cruel puppet show. The supporting character Benny, played by Isaiah Mustafa, operates as the film's closest approximation to a moral center, a man who joined the resistance out of genuine ideological conviction rather than personal trauma. His interactions with Boy are characterized by a gentle bewilderment, an attempt to connect with someone who exists on an entirely different existential plane. The analysis of Benny's narrative function explains that he represents the ordinary person thrust into extraordinary circumstances, providing a baseline of normal human reaction against which Boy's profound abnormality can be measured. The fight scene inside the television studio, where Boy interrupts a live broadcast of the culling, carries a dense metatextual weight. Boy's violence is literally being filmed and presumably broadcast to the population he is attempting to liberate, making the audience within the film a stand-in for the audience watching the film itself. This analysis of the sequence's layered spectatorship explains that Moore implicates all viewers in the spectacle, asking whether watching violent liberation is meaningfully different from watching violent oppression when both are packaged as entertainment. The hallucinogenic sequences where Boy's grip on reality loosens provide the film's most experimental and visually arresting moments. Reality warps into pixelated artifacts, the dead speak in corrupted audio files, and the boundaries between the game world and the material world dissolve entirely. These sequences are analyzed as windows into Boy's actual cognitive processing, revealing that his mind no longer distinguishes between rendered polygons and flesh, between sprite animations and living beings, a final and complete triumph of the shaman's programming over authentic perception. The maternal archetype undergoes a radical deconstruction through the dual figures of the murdered mother and Hilda van der Kooi. The false mother is remembered exclusively in soft focus, warm-toned flashbacks of domestic bliss, a perfect Madonna figure whose death justifies all subsequent violence. Hilda, the biological mother, is a cold, calculating matriarch whose maternal instincts have been sublimated entirely into the maintenance of political power. The analysis of this maternal binary explains that the film suggests motherhood itself can be a narrative weapon, a convenient emotional shorthand exploited by whoever controls the story. The sound design's most innovative feature is its simulation of auditory processing through vibration and visual cues. When characters speak to Boy, the film often emphasizes the physical movement of lips and the subtle vibrations transmitted through floors and walls, elements a deaf person might actually rely upon. This analysis of the acoustic perspective explains that the sound team constructed a plausible sensory alternative to hearing, translating acoustic information into visual and haptic equivalents that make Boy's communicative capabilities feel earned rather than magically transcended. The film's relationship to its clear cinematic influences, particularly John Wick and The Raid, requires nuanced analysis to avoid charges of mere imitation. Where John Wick's combat is defined by technical precision and professional efficiency, Boy's fighting style is improvisational, desperate, and marked by frequent errors and near misses. The explanation distinguishes these approaches, arguing that the film uses its influences as a vocabulary rather than a template, speaking the language of modern action cinema, but inflecting it with a distinctive accent of amateurish, emotional brutality. The color grading throughout the film follows a strict emotional logic that rewards attentive viewing. Scenes within the Van der Kooi compound are bathed in cold, clinical blues and sterile whites, evoking the antiseptic cruelty of corporate fascism. The shaman's forest sequences shift to earthy greens and browns, a deceptive naturalism that masks psychological horrors. The analysis of the color script explains how the film's palette guides emotional response subconsciously, preparing the viewer for tonal shifts before any narrative information is delivered. The character of Basho, played by Andrew Koji, brings a weary cynicism to the resistance that counterbalances Benny's idealism. His dialogue suggests a long history of failed revolutions and compromised principles, a man who has seen too many liberators become new tyrants. The analysis of Basho's narrative role explains that he injects a necessary note of political realism into the otherwise fantastical proceedings, hinting at the cyclical nature of violent regime change that extends beyond the film's immediate story. The film's marketing campaign, which heavily emphasized the comedic elements and John Benjamin's involvement, created expectations that the actual text subverts. Audiences expecting a deadpan action comedy in the vein of Deadpool instead encountered extended sequences of genuinely disturbing psychological horror and graphic violence that resists easy laughter. The analysis of this marketing misdirection explains that it likely contributed to the polarized reception, as the film's tonal complexity was flattened into a more sellable but ultimately inaccurate comedic pitch. The training sequences between the shaman and young boy constitute a darkened version of the classic martial arts mentorship trope, where films like The Karate Kid or even Kill Bill present training as an empowering, character-building process. Every lesson the shaman imparts is an act of spiritual destruction. The analysis of these sequences explains that Boy is not being built up but hollowed out, his natural personality scooped away to make room for programmed combat protocols, a process more akin to demonic possession than education. The brief moments of stillness between action sequences carry disproportionate emotional weight, functioning as the only windows into Boy's unguarded self. When the fighting stops and the inner voice falls momentarily silent, Skarsgård's face communicates an oceanic exhaustion and confusion that dialogue could only dilute. This analysis of the film's quiet moments explains that the true tragedy of Boy's existence is only visible in these pauses, when the weapon has no target and the person underneath briefly surfaces, gasping for air before being submerged again. The thematic treatment of names and identity throughout the script rewards linguistic analysis. The protagonist is simply Boy, a generic designation that denies him individual identity from the outset. June 27th, his sister's designation, reduces a human being to a calendar date, a bureaucratic filing. The Van der Kooi family, by contrast, possesses a full, prestigious surname that carries political weight. The analysis of naming conventions explains that the regime literally owns language itself, distributing identity as a privilege rather than a birthright. The film's depiction of media manipulation extends beyond the obvious culling broadcasts into more subtle forms of propaganda. Background screens constantly display state messaging. Public spaces are designed to channel attention toward official narratives, and even the architecture seems calibrated for surveillance. The analysis of the film's media ecology explains that the Van der Kooi regime understands that physical control is insufficient without cognitive control, and that the battle for reality itself is fought on screens before it ever reaches the streets. The relationship between physical violence and emotional catharsis in the film is deliberately broken, a choice that frustrates standard action movie expectations. Boy kills and kills, yet each death brings him no closer to peace, his inner voice growing more frantic rather than more satisfied. The analysis of this anti-cathartic structure explains that the film makes a philosophical argument. Violence may solve practical problems, but can never heal psychological wounds, especially when those wounds were deliberately inflicted to fuel more violence. The production design of the Van der Kooi family's living quarters incorporates subtle Art Deco influences that evoke the aesthetics of historical fascist movements, while their technology suggests a sterile futurism. This temporal hybridity creates an unsettling atmosphere, where the past's most destructive political impulses have survived into a technologically advanced future. The analysis of the set decoration explains that the design team created a visual argument about fascism's adaptability, its capacity to update its aesthetics while maintaining its core brutal logic. The film's approach to disability representation, while imperfect, makes notable strides in presenting a deaf-mute protagonist whose condition is neither magical nor tragic. Boy's deafness creates genuine tactical challenges and communication barriers, but it also grants him a unique perspective that is presented as valuable rather than pitiable. The analysis of the film's disability politics explains that while it occasionally lapses into superscript tropes where disability is compensated by extraordinary abilities, its fundamental treatment of Boy as an agent rather than an object of sympathy represents meaningful progress. The graphic violence's aesthetic qualities deserve analysis beyond mere shock value or exploitation. The blood sprays in geometric patterns reminiscent of Japanese calligraphy, bodies crumple in poses that evoke classical painting, and the color of gore is deliberately stylized rather than realistic. The explanation for this aestheticized violence is that the film operates in a register of heightened reality where blood becomes ink, wounds become brushstrokes, and the entire project reveals itself as a violent comic book rather than a documentary of suffering. The shaman's ultimate defeat carries symbolic weight that transcends the physical victory. When Boy and Mina finally overcome him, they are not merely killing a man but dismantling the entire false reality he constructed for them. The analysis of the villain's death explains that it represents the execution of a false god, the destruction of the author who wrote their tragic story, leaving them terrifyingly free to author their own narrative for the first time in their lives. The film's treatment of childhood as a site of both vulnerability and latent power creates a recurring motif throughout the narrative. Boy's inner child, represented by the game voice, refuses to be fully extinguished despite years of brutal conditioning, and it is this preserved childishness that ultimately enables him to connect with his real sister. The analysis of the childhood theme explains that the film argues for the indestructibility of the child self, suggesting that even the most thorough brainwashing cannot entirely erase the original personality's deepest emotional attachments. The spatial geography of the final act, which moves from the underground bunker upward toward the surface, inverts the traditional hero's journey into the underworld. Boy and Mina are not descending into darkness to retrieve something, but ascending into light to escape something, a movement from manufactured hell toward an unknown but genuine reality. The analysis of this vertical journey explains that the film maps moral progress onto physical elevation, with truth and freedom located at higher altitudes than lies and imprisonment. The film's legacy potential lies not in its box office performance, but in its function as a lightning rod for debates about the permissible limits of tonal experimentation in genre cinema. Its willingness to be simultaneously juvenile and profound, grotesque and beautiful, derivative and singular, makes it a fascinating case study in the contradictions of contemporary action filmmaking. The analysis of the film's cultural position explains that it will likely be rediscovered and reappraised by future audiences, more comfortable with the chaotic emotional palettes that characterize online native aesthetic sensibilities. The film's legacy potential lies not in its box office performance, but in its function as a lightning rod for debates about the permissible limits of tonal experimentation in genre cinema. Its willingness to be simultaneously juvenile and profound, grotesque and beautiful, derivative and singular, makes it a fascinating case study in the contradictions of contemporary action filmmaking. The analysis of the film's cultural position explains that it will likely be rediscovered and reappraised by future audiences, more comfortable with the chaotic emotional palettes that characterize online native aesthetic sensibilities. The film's opening minutes operate as a brutalist overture, compressing an entire childhood of trauma into a frenetic montage that deliberately disorients the viewer before any emotional attachment can solidify. This structural choice reflects the protagonist's own fractured memory, where the murder of his family exists not as a coherent narrative, but as a series of sensory fragments that the shaman later weaponizes and rearranges into a false but actionable mythology. The analysis explains that Moore refuses to grant the audience comfortable access to the inciting tragedy, instead forcing viewers to experience it as Boy does, in glimpses, flashes, and unreliable recollections that resist the closure a traditional flashback structure would provide. The casting of Famke Janssen as Hilda van der Kooi carries intertextual weight that attentive viewers will recognize from her previous portrayals of formidable matriarchal figures and villainous women. Her physical bearing, the deliberate stillness with which she occupies space, and the modulated cruelty of her vocal delivery all suggest a performer who understands that true villainy resides not in histrionic outbursts but in the calm, almost maternal condescension with which she orders mass executions. The performance analysis reveals that Jansen plays Hilda as a CEO who happens to be a dictator, collapsing the distinction between corporate malfeasance and state violence into a single, terrifyingly recognizable archetype. The hallucination sequences involving Boy's sister Mina function on multiple psychological registers simultaneously, serving as conscience, comfort, and accusation all at once. The spectral Mina appears at moments of moral crisis, her presence a reminder of the childhood innocence that Boy has been programmed to believe he is avenging even as his actions further entomb that innocence beneath layers of blood. The analysis of these ghostly visitations explains that they represent the last autonomous part of Boy's psyche, the internal resistance movement that the shaman's chemical and psychological warfare could never fully pacify despite years of systematic assault. The film's approach to gun violence differs markedly from its approach to hand-to-hand combat, a distinction that rewards analytical attention. Firearms in this world are impersonal, almost bureaucratic instruments of death, associated with the Van der Kooi enforcers and the anonymous machinery of state oppression. When Boy fights with his body, using improvised weapons or bare hands, the violence becomes intimate, physical, and morally complicated in ways that distant gunfire can never be. This analysis of the weaponry taxonomy explains that the film creates a moral hierarchy of violence, where proximity to the victim correlates directly with the humanity of the killer. The visual effects employed to render Boy's inner world deserve scrutiny for their deliberately dated, almost retro quality that evokes early 2000s arcade graphics rather than contemporary photorealistic gaming. The pixelated overlays, the health bar aesthetics, and the fighting game interface elements that occasionally intrude upon reality all speak to a specific generational experience of gaming that is inherently nostalgic and therefore associated with childhood. The analysis explains that the VFX team intentionally avoided modern graphical sophistication, understanding that the emotional resonance of the game world depends on its recognizable obsolescence as a relic of Boy's interrupted past. The film's treatment of the resistance as an organization reveals a deep cynicism about organized political opposition in dystopian contexts. The resistance members we meet are few, demoralized, and largely ineffectual, their grand plans reduced to desperate improvisations, and their ideology barely articulated beyond survival. This analysis of the film's political imagination suggests that Moore is less interested in celebrating revolutionary heroism than in depicting the exhausted, compromised reality of opposition movements operating under conditions of total media and military domination, where victory is measured in moments of survival rather than structural transformation. The sound mixing during combat sequences employs a sophisticated layering technique that distinguishes between subjective and objective audio. When the camera inhabits Boy's perspective, the soundtrack muffles the exterior world and amplifies the internal chaos of his game voice and heightened physiological sounds like heartbeat and breath. When the camera pulls back to a more omniscient viewpoint, the full cacophony of battle rushes back in. The analysis of this audio subjectivity explains that the sound design teaches the audience to recognize whose experience they are sharing at any given moment, creating an auditory grammar that is as expressive as the visual language. The concept of leveling up structures Boy's progression through the Van der Kooi compound, with each defeated enemy representing not just a narrative advancement, but a mechanical upgrade in his combat capabilities. He acquires new weapons, learns enemy patterns, and adapts his tactics in a manner that explicitly mirrors role-playing game progression systems. The analysis of this ludic structure explains that Boy's character development is entirely externalized through combat proficiency, a tragic irony given that his internal development has been deliberately arrested by the shaman's conditioning. The film's brief moments of physical comedy, often involving Boy's complete inability to understand social cues or conversational nuance due to his reliance on lip reading, provide the only genuine levity in an otherwise unrelentingly grim narrative. These moments are not merely comic relief but functional demonstrations of his isolation, showing that his disability creates barriers that violence cannot overcome and that his inner game voice, for all its witty commentary, is a poor substitute for genuine human connection. The analysis of these comedic beats explains that they serve to underline the tragedy of his condition rather than alleviate it. The production design of the arcade cabinet that houses Super Dragon Punch Force 3 is rendered with fetishistic detail, its weathered joystick, faded decals, and flickering screen suggesting an object that has survived the apocalypse through sheer cultural persistence. The game machine functions as a secular shrine, the last intact artifact of Boy's childhood and the source of his entire moral and heroic framework. This analysis of the arcade cabinet's symbolic function explains that it represents the persistence of art and play even under totalitarian conditions, a small, defiant reminder that the human impulse toward imagination cannot be entirely eradicated by political violence. The production design of the arcade cabinet that houses Super Dragon Punch Force 3 is rendered with fetishistic detail, its weathered joystick, faded decals, and flickering screen suggesting an object that has survived the apocalypse through sheer cultural persistence. The game machine functions as a secular shrine, the last intact artifact of Boy's childhood and the source of his entire moral and heroic framework. This analysis of the arcade cabinet's symbolic function explains that it represents the persistence of art and play even under totalitarian conditions, a small, defiant reminder that the human impulse toward imagination cannot be entirely eradicated by political violence. The film's treatment of female characters, while limited by its single-minded focus on Boy's perspective, nonetheless offers a nuanced spectrum of responses to patriarchal and authoritarian power. Hilda van der Kooi has internalized and perfected masculine-coded brutality while maintaining a feminine public persona. June 27th has been entirely dehumanized into a faceless instrument, and the hallucinated Mina exists only as a projection of male guilt. The feminist analysis explains that the film depicts a world where women's identities are systematically consumed by male power structures, though it stops short of imagining alternatives beyond survival. The editing rhythm during the final confrontation between Boy, Mina, and the shaman shifts dramatically from the rapid cutting that characterizes earlier action sequences to longer, more painful takes that refuse to cut away from suffering. This stylistic shift forces the audience to sit with the brutality without the relief of quick cuts, transforming what could have been a cathartic revenge beat into an exhausting, almost unbearable endurance test. The analysis of this editorial deceleration explains that the film uses duration itself as an argument against the glamorization of violence, insisting that real combat is slow, ugly, and devoid of the balletic grace that cinema typically bestows upon it. The film's engagement with the ethics of revenge is fundamentally destabilized by the revelation that Boy's grievance is entirely fabricated. Traditional revenge narratives grant their protagonists an unimpeachable moral claim that justifies escalating violence, but the film retroactively reveals that Boy has no such claim, making his entire rampage a kind of catastrophic mistake. This analysis of the revenge structure explains that the film mounts an implicit critique of the entire genre, suggesting that the satisfying equation of wrong plus vengeance equals justice is always built on stories we tell ourselves, stories that may have no relationship to truth whatsoever. The performance of Yayan Ruhian as the shaman draws on his established screen persona as an unstoppable martial arts force, while complicating it with a paternal cruelty that is far more disturbing than simple villainy. His physical control is absolute, his movements economical and precise, yet his eyes communicate a profound investment in Boy's development that resembles genuine care before it is revealed as monstrous manipulation. The performance analysis explains that Ruhian plays the shaman as a perverse artist, sculpting Boy's body and mind with the devotion of a master craftsman who loves his creation precisely to the degree that he has destroyed the person it replaced. The film's world-building through background advertising and propaganda posters creates a dense textual environment that rewards freeze-frame analysis. Slogans about unity, purity, and the collective good appear in nearly every public space, their relentless positivity forming a sickening counterpoint to the violence they authorize. This analysis of the diegetic media landscape explains that the van der Kooi regime has perfected the aesthetic language of corporate wellness culture, repurposing the rhetoric of self-improvement and community into the justification for industrial-scale murder. The relationship between Boy's physical adulthood and his emotional childhood creates a disturbing, uncanny valley effect that Skarsgård exploits to maximum effect. His body is hypermasculine, a sculpted engine of destruction, yet his expressions, his confusion, and his desperate need for guidance belong to a frightened child who never completed the developmental tasks of adolescence. This analysis of the character's psychological age explains that Boy is a monster created by trauma, a child's soul trapped in a weapon's body, and his tragedy lies in the impossibility of reconciling these two incompatible modes of being. The film's musical score incorporates leitmotifs that are associated not with characters, but with emotional states, a Wagnerian approach adapted to the logic of a video game soundtrack. The vengeance theme, the sister theme, and the shaman's theme recur in various arrangements throughout the film, their transformations mirroring Boy's evolving understanding of his situation. The musical analysis explains that composer Ludwig Furcell created an auditory architecture that does the work of emotional orientation, guiding audience response through recognition and variation, even when the narrative becomes too chaotic for conscious processing. The brief scene in which Boy encounters a mirror and studies his own reflection without the mediation of his game voice represents a rare moment of unmediated self-perception. The inner voice falls silent, and Skarsgård's face registers something approaching existential terror as he confronts the reality of what he has become without the comforting fiction of his heroic narrative. This analysis of the mirror scene explains that it functions as the film's philosophical center, the moment when the constructed self threatens to collapse and the void beneath becomes briefly visible. The film's treatment of the sibling bond as the only reliable emotional anchor in a world of systematic deception provides its sole note of genuine, unironic sentiment. Boy and Mina's connection predates the shaman's brainwashing, predates the Van der Koy's atrocities, and ultimately proves stronger than any of the false narratives imposed upon them. This analysis of the sibling relationship explains that the film locates its residual humanism in biological attachment, suggesting that even totalitarian control and chemical manipulation cannot sever the most fundamental bonds of kinship. The choreography of the factory and warehouse fight sequences emphasizes horizontal movement through industrial spaces cluttered with dangerous machinery, creating a constantly shifting landscape of potential weapons and hazards. Fighters are thrown onto conveyor belts, impaled on manufacturing equipment, and crushed by hydraulic presses, the industrial environment becoming an active participant in the violence. The analysis of these industrial combat sequences explains that the setting literalizes the film's argument about the dehumanization of labor under fascism, where workers' bodies and industrial machinery are interchangeable components of the death system. The film's final image, of Boy and Mina emerging into uncertain daylight, deliberately denies the audience a clear sense of what awaits them, or even whether their escape constitutes a happy ending. The world outside the bunker is entirely undefined, a blank space that could contain anything from a thriving human civilization to a nuclear wasteland. This analysis of the open ending explains that the film's ultimate argument is existential rather than political. Freedom is not a destination but an ongoing condition of uncertainty, and the siblings' real struggle begins the moment their programmed purpose expires. The film's engagement with the aesthetics of professional wrestling, particularly in the character introductions for the Van der Koy enforcers, creates a theatricality that acknowledges the performative nature of violence within the narrative. Each enforcer enters with distinctive costuming, signature weapons, and a clearly defined fighting persona, much like wrestlers entering a ring. This analysis of the wrestling influence explains that the film understands violence as spectacle before it is ever practical, and that totalitarian regimes depend on the theatrical dimension of force as much as its material application. The psychological dynamic of the shaman's training program deserves analysis through the lens of cult indoctrination techniques, including isolation, sleep deprivation, controlled substance administration, and the systematic destruction of prior identity. The shaman isolates Boy from all alternative perspectives, exhausts his cognitive resistance, chemically destabilizes his reality testing, and then offers a new identity as the only available relief from unbearable psychological pain. This analysis of the indoctrination process explains that the film depicts, with surprising accuracy, the mechanisms by which abusive systems create willing instruments out of unwilling subjects. The film's treatment of truth as a weapon rather than a value constitutes one of its darkest philosophical positions. Both the Van der Koy regime and the shaman deploy truth strategically, the regime through propaganda, and the shaman through his false memory implantation, and neither party has any commitment to accuracy beyond its instrumental utility. This epistemological analysis explains that the film depicts a world where power determines truth entirely, and where the distinction between factual reality and useful fiction has been eroded beyond recognition by competing regimes of manipulation. The costume design for the Van der Kooi enforcers incorporates elements of military uniforms, sports equipment, and fetish wear, creating a sartorial vocabulary of intimidation that is deliberately incoherent and therefore more disturbing than any single reference could be. Their appearance signals violence without specifying its nature, combining the discipline of soldiers with the unpredictability of athletes and the transgression of sexual subcultures. This analysis of the villain costuming explains that the design team created a visual shorthand for a regime that has collapsed all traditional categories of identity into a single, terrifyingly mutable performance of power. The film's pacing alternates between extended action sequences that push the limits of audience endurance and brief, almost subliminal character moments that provide the only access to interiority. This rhythm is physically exhausting by design, wearing down the viewer's defenses just as the shaman's training wore down boys, creating a state of heightened suggestibility in which the film's tonal shifts and narrative reversals can land with maximum impact. The analysis of the pacing strategy explains that the film is structured as an assault on the audience's cognitive processing, a cinematic analog to the psychological violence it depicts. The theme of substitution pervades the narrative at every level, from the replacement of Boy's real family with a false one in his memory to the replacement of his inner voice with a video game character to the replacement of genuine political resistance with theatrical rebellion. Everything authentic in Boy's world has been swapped for a convincing counterfeit, and his journey consists of discovering these substitutions one by one without losing his mind entirely. This thematic analysis explains that the film presents identity itself as a substitution effect, a copy of a copy for which no original can ever be located or verified. The film's relationship to the martial arts genre is complicated by its protagonist's physical prowess being entirely the product of abuse rather than discipline. Traditional martial arts narratives present fighting skill as the reward for spiritual development and moral worth, but Boy's abilities are the scars of torture, his excellence purchased at the cost of his humanity. This analysis of the martial arts framework explains that the film inverts the genre's moral assumptions, presenting physical perfection as evidence of psychological damage rather than enlightenment. The supporting cast's function as a kind of Greek chorus, commenting on Boy's actions and the absurdity of their world without being able to alter its course, creates a layer of metatextual awareness within the narrative. Benny and Basho know they are characters in a ridiculous and tragic story, and their dialogue frequently acknowledges the absurdity of their circumstances with a weariness that implicates the audience in the same recognition. This analysis of the choral function explains that the film embeds its own critical commentary within itself, anticipating and partially disarming the objections a skeptical viewer might raise. The cinematography during the hallucination sequences employs lens choices and color temperatures that are deliberately inconsistent with the film's established visual grammar, signaling a departure from consensus reality through purely formal means. Focus becomes unreliable, the frame distorts at the edges, and the color grade shifts toward oversaturated primaries that evoke the palette of a child's toy rather than an adult's world. This analysis of the hallucinatory cinematography explains that the film develops a visual language for madness that is distinct from its language for violence, ensuring that the audience can always distinguish between what is real and what is merely real to Boy. The film's refusal to provide a romantic subplot or even the suggestion of sexual desire in its protagonist represents a significant departure from action cinema conventions. Boy's entire libidinal economy is channeled into violence, his only intimate relationships being with his dead sister and his video game voice, a substitution pattern that marks him as profoundly inhuman by the standards of the genre. This analysis of the film's asexual protagonist explains that Boy's inability to desire is another dimension of his arrested development, another way the shaman's training has rendered him something less than fully alive. The credit sequence and its relationship to the spin-off video game release extend the film's metatextual commentary into the real world of consumer capitalism. The actual playable game, Super Dragon Punch Force 3, exists as a commodity that audiences can purchase, making the film's critique of commodified violence simultaneously sincere and hypocritical, an analysis that explains the uncomfortable position of any anti-capitalist artwork distributed by a major studio within a capitalist marketplace. The film's handling of its climactic revelation deserves analysis for its structural elegance, as the twist recontextualizes not just the plot, but the very act of watching the film. Viewers who enjoyed the violence, who rooted for Boy's revenge, discover that they were cheering for a fiction within a fiction, manipulated by the same narrative logic that the shaman used to control Boy. This meta-narrative analysis explains that the film springs its trap on the audience as much as on its protagonist, making viewers confront their own appetite for violent spectacle and the stories they tell themselves to justify that appetite. The production's sound design employs a recurring motif of mechanical failure, of systems breaking down, of static and feedback and corrupted signals that suggest a world where even the machinery of control is deteriorating. These sounds accumulate throughout the film, creating an auditory texture of entropy that undermines the Van der Kooi regime's claims to perfect order and hints at the possibility of systemic collapse. The analysis of the sonic degradation motif explains that the soundtrack tells a story of decay that the visuals only intermittently acknowledge, preparing the audience for the regime's vulnerability long before the narrative confirms it. The film's treatment of the body as both a weapon and a prison reflects a deep ambivalence about physical existence that pervades the entire narrative. Boy's body is his only tool, his only means of agency, yet it is also the product of torture, the cage in which his childhood self remains trapped, the evidence of his violation made visible in every hypertrophied muscle. This corporeal analysis explains that the film cannot decide whether the body is a site of empowerment or victimization, and this indecision becomes its most honest statement about the experience of surviving trauma. The geographical movement from wilderness to city to underground bunker to surface creates a spatial narrative that maps onto the psychological journey from isolation to socialization to confrontation to liberation. Each environment demands different survival strategies and enables different forms of relationship, and Boy's adaptation to each new space measures his gradual recovery of the human capacities the shaman tried to extinguish. This spatial analysis explains that the film's geography is its deepest structural principle, organizing experience into a coherent arc even when the plot threatens to dissolve into chaos. The film's comedic sensibility, heavily reliant on the incongruity between Benjamin's casual, contemporary American cadences and the grotesque ultraviolence occurring on screen, belongs to a specific tradition of ironic detachment that characterizes much millennial and post-millennial humor. The inner voice comments on atrocities with the effect of someone live-tweeting a disaster, maintaining ironic distance as a defense against genuine horror. This analysis of the film's comic mode explains that it represents an honest, if uncomfortable, portrait of how contemporary audiences have been trained to process extreme imagery through the buffer of irony. The narrative's treatment of the culling as a lottery system evokes Shirley Jackson's classic short story while updating its critique for a media-saturated age. Where Jackson's lottery was a rural, communal ritual whose origins were forgotten, the film's culling is a televised product, complete with sponsors and production values, whose function as population control is openly acknowledged and celebrated. This literary analysis explains that the film suggests totalitarianism has evolved from the folk horror of Jackson's Village to the corporate horror of reality television, losing none of its brutality while gaining a terrifying media savviness. The character arc of June 27th, traced backward from her introduction as a faceless enforcer to her revelation as Mina, constitutes a hidden tragedy that the film only fully reveals in retrospect. Her journey from traumatized child to brainwashed soldier mirrors Boy's own. But where Boy was given a false mission of revenge, Mina was given no narrative at all, simply conscripted into service and denied even the comfort of believing herself heroic. This analysis of the parallel brainwashing explains that the siblings represent two different products of the same trauma factory, their separate paths illustrating the versatility of systematic psychological destruction. The film's visual quotations from anime, particularly in the exaggerated reaction shots, the speedline backgrounds during moments of realization, and the impossible physics of certain combat maneuvers, situate it within a transnational aesthetic tradition that has become increasingly central to Western action cinema. This analysis of the anime influence explains that the film is part of a broader cultural convergence in which the visual language of Japanese animation has become the default mode for depicting heightened emotional states and spectacular violence, transcending its origins to become a global cinematic vernacular. The psychological concept of splitting, the defense mechanism by which good and bad objects are kept rigidly separate in the mind, provides a useful framework for understanding Boy's cognitive architecture. His dead mother is all good, Hilda van der Kooi is all bad, and the complex reality of women who are both mothers and monsters cannot be integrated into his traumatized worldview. This psychoanalytic analysis explains that Boy's entire quest is an exercise in splitting, and his psychological growth consists of his painful, incomplete movement toward an integrated perception that can accommodate moral complexity. The film's attitude toward its own violence remains fundamentally unstable, oscillating between celebration and critique without ever resolving into a coherent position. Sequences clearly designed to elicit audience cheers for particularly inventive kills sit alongside moments of genuine horror at the consequences of violence, creating a tonal dissonance that reads either as sophisticated ambiguity or simple incoherence, depending on the viewer's sympathy. This metacritical analysis explains that the film's most interesting quality is precisely this irresolution: its refusal to tell the audience whether it is a critique of violent entertainment or a particularly stylish example of it. The use of practical effects for the majority of the film's gore, supplemented by digital enhancement rather than replacement, gives the violence a physicality and weight that pure CGI cannot replicate. Bodies have mass, blood has viscosity, and the destruction of human tissue follows the laws of physics even when the combat itself defies them. This technical analysis explains that the practical effects ground the film's more fantastical elements in a material reality that makes the horror of violence inescapable no matter how stylized the presentation becomes. The film's cultural positioning as a festival premiere that subsequently received a wide theatrical release speaks to the shifting boundaries between art house and genre cinema in the contemporary marketplace. A film this violent, this strange, and this tonally experimental would once have been confined to midnight movie circuits, but the success of films like John Wick and Everything Everywhere All at Once has created space for formally adventurous action cinema within mainstream distribution. This industry analysis explains that the film is a beneficiary and a test case of this shifting landscape, its commercial underperformance perhaps indicating the limits of mainstream tolerance for the truly bizarre. The intricate relationship between the film's sound design and its protagonist's deafness extends beyond mere silence into a sophisticated exploration of vibration as a sensory substitute. Low-frequency rumbles from explosions and footsteps transmit through floors and walls, visualized through subtle camera shakes, and emphasized in the audio mix as tactile sensations rather than sounds. This analysis reveals that the sound team constructed an entire alternative sensory vocabulary, teaching the audience to perceive the world through Boy's embodied experience, where the boundary between hearing and feeling dissolves entirely, and where music becomes something felt in the chest rather than processed through the ears. The film's treatment of architecture as ideology deserves extended analysis, particularly the Van der Kooi compound's vertical organization that literally elevates the ruling family above the masses they exploit. The lower levels house the machinery of death and the workers who operate it. The middle levels contain the bureaucratic apparatus of state control, and the penthouse hosts the family in obscene luxury, a spatial hierarchy that makes political stratification physically visible. This architectural analysis explains that the building is the regime's thesis statement rendered in concrete and steel, and Boy's ascent through its levels is an act of political critique performed with fists rather than words. The decision to cast a hearing actor as a deaf character invites scrutiny regarding representation and authenticity in disability casting, a conversation the film enters awkwardly but not without awareness. Skarsgård's performance, while physically committed and emotionally nuanced, remains a hearing person's interpretation of deaf experience, filtered through research and imagination rather than lived reality. This analysis of the casting politics acknowledges the legitimate critiques while noting that the film's broader treatment of disability, though imperfect, represents a meaningful if incomplete step toward inclusion in a genre historically indifferent to such considerations. The hallucinated Mina sequences employ a distinct visual grammar of soft focus, warm color temperatures, and slightly slowed frame rates that evoke the aesthetic language of memory and dreams in cinema. These stylistic choices mark her appearances as ontologically distinct from the film's reality, yet the emotional truth they convey is presented as more real than the cold, sharp-edged actuality of the Van der Kooi compound. This analysis of the ghost sequences explains that the film argues for the validity of subjective emotional experience over objective fact, suggesting that what we feel to be true may matter more than what actually occurred. The performance style demanded of the Van der Kooi enforcers requires each actor to construct a complete character through physicality alone, as most are denied dialogue or even visible faces behind their elaborate masks and helmets. Their fighting styles, their gait, their gestural tics, and their reactions to injury must communicate everything the audience needs to understand about their personalities and their relationships to violence. This analysis of the physical performance demands explains that the film trusts bodily expression as a complete communicative medium, a trust that aligns it with silent cinema traditions and with Boy's own experience of reading the world through physical cues. The film's engagement with the concept of free will becomes increasingly urgent as the narrative progresses and the extent of Boy's programming is revealed. If every choice he made was implanted, if his most deeply held convictions were chemical fictions, then in what sense can he be said to have acted at all rather than merely executed a program written by the shaman? This philosophical analysis explains that the film raises deterministic questions it cannot fully answer, leaving the audience suspended in the uncomfortable position of having rooted for a protagonist whose agency was largely illusory. The use of slow motion during key emotional beats rather than action sequences inverts standard action cinema practice, reserving temporal manipulation for moments of psychological significance rather than spectacular violence. When Boy recognizes his sister, when the truth of his past breaks through the chemical fog, time stretches to accommodate the magnitude of the revelation, while the fighting itself proceeds at a relentless, unadorned pace. This analysis of temporal manipulation explains that the film prioritizes emotional time over action time, suggesting that the real drama occurs in moments of recognition rather than in feats of physical prowess. The marketing material's emphasis on the film's comedic elements created a frame of expectation that the actual text systematically dismantles, as the humor becomes progressively darker and less frequent as the narrative descends into its tragic dimensions. Early scenes balance gore with genuine laughs, but by the third act, the comedy has largely evaporated, replaced by an unrelenting seriousness that the trailers never suggested. This analysis of the marketing misalignment explains that the film was sold as a comedy with violent elements when it is more accurately a tragedy with occasional comedic relief, a category error that likely contributed to audience confusion and polarized responses. The production design of the shaman's training compound incorporates elements of traditional Southeast Asian architecture alongside makeshift industrial modifications, creating a visual hybridity that reflects his position between ancient traditions of martial discipline and modern technologies of psychological control. The space feels simultaneously timeless and urgently contemporary, a liminal zone where old ways of breaking human beings have been updated with pharmaceutical precision. This design analysis explains that the shaman's compound is a factory for the production of human weapons, its aesthetics masking its industrial function beneath a veneer of spiritual authenticity. The narrative's treatment of the resistance's failure to achieve meaningful political change before Boy's arrival suggests a pessimistic view of collective action under conditions of total media control. The resistance has been reduced to a handful of survivors hiding in the infrastructure, their grand plans abandoned, their ideology preserved only in bitter jokes and half-remembered slogans. This political analysis explains that the film depicts opposition as a posture rather than a program, a refusal to comply that has no realistic path to victory and is sustained only by stubbornness and the absence of alternatives. The film's color grading during the culling sequences shifts toward the oversaturated, high-contrast palette of reality television, complete with the slightly too bright skin tones and artificially vivid primaries that characterize the genre. This visual quotation of reality TV aesthetics creates an unsettling familiarity, suggesting that the murder being broadcast belongs to the same category of entertainment as cooking competitions and home renovation shows. This color analysis explains that the grading itself performs a critique, using the visual language of mass entertainment to indict the audience's own desensitization to mediated violence. The character of Gideon Van der Kooi embodies the figure of the propagandist with a specificity that rewards careful attention to his dialogue and mannerisms. He speaks in slogans even when supposedly conversing privately, his personality entirely subsumed by his professional function, a man who has become indistinguishable from the messages he crafts. This character analysis explains that Gideon represents the final stage of ideological commitment, the point at which the propagandist can no longer distinguish between the lies he tells and the thoughts he thinks, a walking cautionary tale about the self-consuming nature of systematic deception. The fight choreography's incorporation of Boy's deafness as a tactical consideration rather than merely a character trait elevates the action beyond generic convention. He is shown relying on peripheral vision to track multiple attackers, feeling vibrations through surfaces to anticipate approaches from behind, and exploiting enemies' assumption that silence equals unawareness. This tactical analysis explains that the choreography treats Boy's deafness as a complete sensory system with its own advantages and vulnerabilities, refusing to present it as either pure disability or superpower, but as a different way of perceiving combat space. The film's emotional climax, the silent recognition scene between Boy and Mina, derives its power from the accumulated weight of all the false memories and real suffering that preceded it. Two people who were programmed to be enemies, who were told the other was dead, who were weaponized against each other's interests, finally occupy the same frame and must construct a relationship from the rubble of their respective brainwashings. This emotional analysis explains that the scene earns its pathos through restraint, the siblings' silence more eloquent than any dialogue could be, their mutual recognition a small, fragile victory against the systems that tried to erase them. The sound mixing during the revelation sequences employs a technique of gradual unmuffling, as if the truth is slowly coming into auditory focus alongside the visual and narrative clarity. The muffled, distant quality of earlier scenes gives way to crisper, more present audio as Boy's understanding clarifies, the sound design itself performing the process of awakening. This audio analysis explains that the mix functions as a parallel narrative. Telling the story of Boy's cognitive liberation through purely sonic means that bypass conscious processing and speak directly to the audience's nervous systems. The film's depiction of drug-induced memory manipulation, while heightened for dramatic effect, engages with genuine psychological research on the malleability of memory and the ease with which false recollections can be implanted. Studies have repeatedly demonstrated that memories are reconstructed rather than retrieved, that each recall is an act of creation susceptible to suggestion, and that even vivid, emotionally charged memories can be entirely fabricated. This psychological analysis explains that the film's most fantastic element is also its most scientifically grounded, the shaman's methods representing an extreme but not implausible extension of documented memory phenomena. The production's decision to stage the majority of the film within confined, often underground spaces creates a claustrophobic atmosphere that externalizes Boy's psychological imprisonment. Even when he is physically free to move, the walls are always visible, the ceilings always low, the horizon always blocked by concrete and steel, a spatial metaphor for the limits the shaman has placed on his consciousness. This spatial analysis explains that the film withholds the visual relief of open spaces until the final frames, making the siblings' emergence into daylight a genuine liberation experienced viscerally by an audience that has been trapped underground with them. The film's relationship to its producer Sam Raimi's stylistic legacy is evident in its tonal oscillations between horror, comedy, and action, its fascination with bodily transformation and mutilation, and its use of exaggerated camera movements and perspective shots. The Raimi influence manifests most clearly in the film's willingness to be silly and grotesque in the same moment, to find humor in dismemberment, and to treat the camera as an active, almost mischievous participant in the narrative. This auteurist analysis explains that the film functions as a kind of Raimi tribute filtered through a younger director's sensibility, honoring the master's tonal adventurousness while updating the aesthetics for contemporary genre expectations. The brief glimpses of the world outside the Van der Kooi compound and the shaman's forest suggest a broader civilization that the film deliberately declines to explore. A narrative choice that focuses attention on the microcosm while raising unanswerable questions about context. Are there other city-states? Is resistance organized elsewhere? Does anyone remember a time before the culling? This world-building analysis explains that the film's refusal to answer these questions is strategically sound, maintaining the claustrophobic focus on Boy's experience while acknowledging, through brief, tantalizing glimpses, that his story is not the only one being told in this universe. The film's treatment of healing as an uncertain, ongoing process rather than a triumphant destination distinguishes it from more conventional action narratives that conflate the villain's death with the hero's restoration. Boy and Mina are not healed by their victory, merely freed from the immediate source of their trauma, and the work of reconstruction remains entirely ahead of them as the credits roll. This therapeutic analysis explains that the film respects the complexity of recovery, refusing to offer the false comfort of a clean resolution and instead leaving its protagonists and its audience in the difficult, ambiguous space where real healing might eventually begin. The editing pattern during the training montages employs a deliberately disorienting rhythm that fragments time and space, jumping between seasons, exercises, and stages of Boy's physical development without establishing clear temporal relationships. This fragmentation mirrors the experience of the training itself, the way intense physical discipline collapses chronological time into an endless, repetitive present where only the next repetition, the next set, the next punishment exists. This editorial analysis explains that the montages are experienced rather than understood, their meaning transmitted through rhythm rather than information, a formal choice that implicates the viewer's body in Boy's ordeal. The film's use of voiceover narration as a substitute for the protagonist's missing speech creates an unusual dynamic in which the audience has privileged access to Boy's thoughts while the other characters remain entirely ignorant of his inner life. This asymmetry of information generates both comedy, as his internal commentary contrasts with his external blankness, and tragedy, as his desperate emotional needs go unexpressed and unmet. This narrative analysis explains that the voiceover functions as a glass wall between Boy and the world, transparent to the audience but utterly opaque to everyone who might actually help him. The costume design for the hallucinated Mina draws on imagery of childhood innocence from a specific cultural moment, her dresses and hair ribbons evoking a nostalgic ideal of girlhood that never quite existed. This deliberate artifice signals that the spectral Mina is not a real person, but a composite of Boy's memories and cultural fantasies, a symbol rather than an individual. This costume analysis explains that the film embeds its own critique of the Mina hallucination in its visual presentation, showing the audience that this figure is a construction even before the narrative reveals the same information through plot. The film's thematic engagement with consumption extends beyond the obvious food imagery to encompass the consumption of media, the consumption of bodies through violence, and the consumption of lives through the culling's sacrificial logic. Every character is either a consumer, a consumed object, or, in Boy's case, a weapon that consumes others while being himself consumed by his programming. This thematic analysis explains that consumption provides the film's master metaphor, organizing its various critiques of power, violence, and media into a coherent, if nightmarish, vision of a society that eats itself. The practical stunt work throughout the film deserves recognition for its integration of martial arts, parkour, and traditional Hollywood stunt techniques into a cohesive action vocabulary. Long takes allow the audience to appreciate the athleticism of the performers, the precision of the choreography, and the physical risk involved in creating the film's most spectacular moments. This stunt analysis explains that the practical effects ground the film's more stylized elements in genuine physical achievement, providing an anchor of reality that makes the fantastical violence feel impactful rather than weightless. The film's representation of the Van der Kooi family's internal dynamics reveals a regime that is as much a dysfunctional family as a political entity, its policy decisions driven by sibling rivalries, maternal favoritism, and petty personal grievances. This domestic framing of totalitarian politics suggests that the most horrific systems are often propelled by the most banal human motivations, that genocide can be a family business like any other. This political analysis explains that the film demystifies evil by showing it around the dinner table, arguing that the distance between a squabbling family and a murderous regime is shorter than we prefer to believe. The cinematography's use of shallow depth of field during Boy's subjective moments isolates him from his environment, blurring the background into abstraction and focusing attention entirely on his face and immediate physical circumstances. This technique replicates the tunnel vision of trauma, the way extreme stress narrows perception to immediate threats and eliminates peripheral awareness of context or consequence. This visual analysis explains that the shallow focus is not merely an aesthetic choice but a psychological one, placing the audience inside a perceptual state that is both adaptive for survival and disastrous for understanding. The narrative's withholding of the full truth until the final act creates a dramatic irony that is only legible on second viewing, when every interaction between Boy and the Van der Kooi family reads differently in light of their concealed relationship. Hilda's reactions to Boy, which initially scan as the contempt of an aristocrat for an insurgent, become retrospectively legible as something more complicated, perhaps even something approaching maternal recognition suppressed by political necessity. This rewatchability analysis explains that the film is constructed to reward multiple viewings, its surface coherence masking layers of meaning that only become visible once the twist is known and the audience can read against the narrative's initial presentation. The film's treatment of the body as a text upon which violence writes meaning connects it to broader traditions in horror and action cinema that understand physical destruction as communication. The shaman reads boys' scars as a record of successful training. The Van der Koys read the bodies of the cult as messages of state power, and the audience reads the carnage as evidence of the film's commitment to its extreme aesthetic. This semiotic analysis explains that bodies in the film are never just bodies. They are always also signs, their destruction always also signification, violence always also language. The brief, almost subliminal insert shots that interrupt the action sequences, lasting only a few frames each, function as a cinematic analog to intrusive memories, the sudden, unwanted recollections that characterize post-traumatic stress. These fragmentary images, often from boys' childhood or from earlier moments of violence, flash across the screen with a violence that mirrors their content, disrupting the narrative flow just as traumatic memories disrupt consciousness. This editorial analysis explains that the insert shots are not decorative but diagnostic, symptoms of a mind that cannot maintain the boundary between present experience and past horror. The film's engagement with the genre convention of the final girl is complicated by its distribution of that function across the sibling pair, with Mina surviving alongside Boy rather than perishing to motivate his vengeance. The sister who was supposed to be dead, whose memory supposedly fueled the entire narrative, turns out to be alive and capable of her own agency, her own violence, her own survival. This feminist analysis explains that the film revises the revenge genre's treatment of dead women as plot devices, restoring agency to the very figure whose fridging traditionally motivates male action heroes. The sound of the shaman's voice, deliberately calm and measured even when issuing the most brutal instructions, creates an auditory signature of controlled malevolence that contrasts sharply with the chaotic noise of combat and the frantic energy of Boy's inner monologue. The shaman never raises his voice because he never needs to, his authority absolute and his control complete, a vocal performance that communicates power through restraint rather than volume. This voice analysis explains that Ruant's vocal choices are as important as his physical performance, creating a villain whose menace resides in his unshakable calm rather than in any display of passion. The film's ultimate moral position, if such a thing can be extracted from its chaotic tonal landscape, seems to be that violence is simultaneously inevitable and irredeemable, necessary for survival in an unjust world, yet incapable of producing justice. Boy must fight to free himself, yet his fighting has damaged him in ways that may never heal, and the film refuses to pretend otherwise even in its most triumphant moments. This ethical analysis explains that the film offers no comfortable moral calculus, leaving its audience, like its protagonists, to navigate an impossible terrain where every option is tainted and the best that can be hoped for is survival with some remnant of humanity intact. The film's credit sequence deserves isolated analysis as a miniature narrative unto itself, employing animated graffiti-style graphics that mutate from childlike drawings into violent imagery, tracing Boy's psychological trajectory in a compressed visual poem. The animation style deliberately evokes the aesthetic of bootleg video game cartridges and underground comic books, cultural artifacts of countercultural expression that exist outside official channels of distribution. Much like the resistance itself operates in the margins of the Van der Koy regime's tightly controlled media environment. This credit sequence analysis explains that the film establishes its thematic concerns and aesthetic allegiances before a single frame of live-action footage appears, priming the audience's visual literacy for the chaos to follow. The depiction of water throughout the film carries symbolic weight that accumulates across the narrative, appearing first in the domestic tranquility of Boy's false memories, then in the shaman's purification rituals that are actually rituals of erasure, and finally in the rain that falls during the climactic escape, a natural force indifferent to human suffering that nonetheless suggests the possibility of cleansing. This elemental analysis traces the motif of water as a substance that both gives and takes life, that can nourish or drown, that the film associates with moments of transformation whether toward healing or toward destruction, never resolving its ambivalent symbolic charge. The performance of the young actor portraying Boy in the childhood flashback sequences must shoulder the enormous dramatic burden of establishing emotional stakes that the adult narrative will systematically dismantle. And the casting directors chose a performer whose physical resemblance to a young Skarsgård reinforces continuity, while his expressive vulnerability makes the subsequent destruction of his character's authentic self genuinely horrifying to contemplate. This casting analysis of the younger iteration explains that the childhood performance is the film's emotional foundation, the baseline of innocence against which all subsequent corruption is measured, and its success is essential to the twist's devastating impact. The film's negotiation with the legacy of dystopian young adult fiction, particularly the Hunger Games franchise from which it borrows the televised death lottery premise, positions it within a crowded marketplace of similar narratives that risk audience fatigue with the tropes of authoritarian spectacle. Where The Hunger Games maintains a essentially liberal humanist faith in the possibility of systemic reform through individual courage, the film under discussion adopts a considerably more cynical posture, suggesting that the systems may be too entrenched, the psyches too damaged, and the alternatives too compromised for genuine liberation to be achievable within the narrative's time frame. This comparative genre analysis explains that the film darkens the dystopian template it inherits, stripping away the consolations that make such narratives palatable to broad audiences. The fight within the television studio control room, where Boy's violence accidentally broadcasts to the entire populace, transforms him from anonymous insurgent into public figure without his knowledge or consent, a mediation of his actions that escapes his control and enters the very propaganda system he is attempting to destroy. The analysis of this sequence reveals a bitter irony at the film's core, the possibility that violent resistance, no matter how personally motivated and tactically successful, inevitably feeds the spectacle it opposes, becoming content for the machine it seeks to dismantle, its meaning appropriated and repurposed by forces beyond the actor's intention. The shaman's pedagogical method, which combines physical brutality with psychedelic-assisted psychological reprogramming, represents a dark synthesis of ancient initiation rites and modern coercive persuasion techniques, a deliberately anachronistic fusion that makes his character difficult to place historically or culturally, and therefore more universally threatening. This methodological analysis explains that the shaman's power derives from his mastery of both the body's physical limits and the mind's chemical vulnerabilities, a comprehensive approach to human reshaping that leaves no aspect of the subject untouched or uncontaminated by his influence. The costume design for Boy himself follows a trajectory from ragged prisoner to streamlined instrument, his clothing becoming progressively more functional, more fitted, and more militaristic as his training progresses and his childhood identity recedes. By the time he enters the Van der Kooi compound, he wears what is essentially a uniform, his body and its coverings equally optimized for violence, the last traces of individual sartorial expression eliminated in favor of pure tactical efficiency. This costume trajectory analysis explains that Boy's clothing tells the story of his dehumanization in parallel with the narrative, his external presentation becoming less personal as his internal self becomes less present. The film's deployment of practical squib effects for gunshot wounds, as opposed to digital blood spray, connects it to a tradition of practical effects cinema that values physical impact over digital convenience, a choice that aligns the film aesthetically with the action cinema of previous decades, even as its tonal experimentation marks it as distinctly contemporary. This technical analysis explains that the practical effects create a materiality of violence that digital effects struggle to replicate, the actual physical disruption of prosthetic bodies and blood packs, generating a visceral response that pixels alone cannot provoke. The narrative's treatment of the Van der Kooi family's internal security apparatus reveals a regime that is fundamentally paranoid, expending enormous resources on surveillance, enforcement, and spectacular punishment that might, in a more secure system, be directed toward productive ends or popular welfare. This allocation of resources toward control rather than development suggests a ruling class that understands its own illegitimacy, that knows its position rests on force rather than consent, and that consequently can never rest easy despite its apparent total dominance. This political economy analysis explains that the regime's excessive violence is a symptom of weakness rather than strength, the desperate overcompensation of rulers who fear the people they rule. The film's use of rack focus during dialogue scenes where Boy is lip-reading directs audience attention to the speaking character's mouth with an insistence that reproduces Boy's own perceptual priorities, the rest of the face and environment softening into irrelevance as the visual information necessary for comprehension is isolated and emphasized. This cinematographic analysis explains that the focus pulling is not merely a stylistic flourish, but a functional representation of depth perception, translating Boy's sensory experience into visual grammar and teaching the audience to watch the way he must watch to understand anything at all. The hallucination sequences in which Boy's game world overlay intrudes upon reality, complete with health bars, combo counters, and fighting game interface elements, represent the most explicit visualization of his cognitive framework, the moments when his internal reality becomes externally legible to the audience. These visual effects are deliberately two-dimensional, refusing to integrate spatially with the three-dimensional environment, marking them as psychological projections rather than supernatural phenomena. This VFX analysis explains that the flatness of the game overlays is a crucial design choice, maintaining the distinction between Boy's perception and consensus reality, even at the moments of their closest convergence. The supporting character of the Resistance medic, who appears briefly to treat Boy's wounds and provides the only instance of gentle, non-transactional physical contact in the entire film, serves as a fleeting reminder of what care looks like in a world organized entirely around harm. Her hands are steady and her voice is soft, and for a few seconds the film allows the possibility of healing as something other than the cessation of violence, something positive rather than merely the absence of attack. This character analysis explains that the medic scene, though brief, is essential to the film's moral economy, demonstrating that tenderness still exists as a human capacity even in circumstances designed to extinguish it. The film's approach to exposition relies heavily on environmental storytelling and visual inference rather than dialogue, a choice that respects the audience's intelligence while also reflecting the protagonist's own limited access to verbal information. Background posters, graffiti, the condition of buildings, and the behavior of extras communicate the world's history and political situation without any character needing to deliver explanatory monologues. This narrative technique analysis explains that the film trusts its visual medium, understanding that a single well-composed image can convey more information more elegantly than pages of dialogue, and that this trust is particularly appropriate for a story centered on a character who cannot hear explanations. The shaman's compound, considered as a psychological space rather than a physical location, functions as a kind of anti-womb, a place where Boy is not born but unmade, not nurtured but systematically stripped of the self his original family had begun to form. The darkness, the confinement, the dependency, and the total control all evoke the circumstances of gestation, but inverted toward death rather than life, toward the creation of a weapon rather than a person. This psychospatial analysis explains that the shaman's compound represents the ultimate perversion of care, a place that mimics the structures of nurturing while serving the purposes of destruction. The film's treatment of time as a subjective experience rather than an objective measure manifests in its unpredictable pacing, which compresses years of training into minutes of screen time while lingering for extended sequences on single moments of violence or revelation. This temporal elasticity reflects the way trauma distorts time perception, stretching moments of horror into eternities while erasing the periods of endurance that separate them. This temporal analysis explains that the film's rhythm is psychologically motivated rather than narratively conventional, its unevenness a formal reproduction of Boy's damaged temporal experience. The color red functions as the film's dominant chromatic motif, appearing not only in the obvious form of blood, but in costume details, lighting choices, and production design elements that gradually saturate the frame as violence escalates. The progression from the muted palette of the shaman's compound to the increasingly red-dominated imagery of the final act charts the narrative's descent into pure carnage through chromatic means, the color grading itself telling the story of escalation. This color motif analysis explains that red becomes a structural principle, organizing visual experience around the film's central concern with the substance that flows when bodies are opened. The film's relationship to the concept of catharsis is deliberately dysfunctional, offering the temporary satisfactions of revenge violence while systematically undermining the psychological premises that make such satisfactions meaningful. Each kill that should bring relief instead brings only the need for the next kill, a treadmill of violence that the film refuses to present as redemptive or even particularly effective. This catharsis analysis explains that the film is structured as a critique of cathartic violence while simultaneously functioning as an example of it, a contradiction that constitutes both its most interesting quality and its most significant limitation. The performance style of the Van der Kooi family members, each operating in a slightly different register of theatricality from melodramatic to deadpan, creates a collective impression of a family that has lost any stable relationship to authentic emotion, performing even their cruelties according to internalized scripts. Hilda's corporate jargon, Gideon's media-trained effect, and the various enforcers' genre-specific performance modes suggest people who have been performing power for so long that the distinction between performance and self has ceased to be meaningful. This performance analysis explains that the Van der Koois are the film's most explicitly theatrical characters because they are the most thoroughly mediatized, their identities constructed for broadcast rather than lived. The sound of Boy's inner voice, provided by H. John Benjamin in a register familiar to audiences from his extensive voice acting career, carries intertextual associations that the film both exploits and complicates. The end.